Liberals have this beautiful utopian vision of how things could be, which is exactly what a pathfinder needs, right? Is a vision of where we're going. Psychologists would call that a useful fiction. And the usefulness of the fiction is that we try to expand our in-group by thinking in this way. And by expanding our in-group, we become less tribalistic. And so it's useful because we can build the UN, multilateral agreements with other countries. Sometimes those things prevent nuclear holocausts from occurring. But ultimately, it is still a fiction. It's not reality, at least not yet.
We are living right now in one of the critical moments of the useful fiction. We're asking all countries to come together and step into that shared vision of a working planet that does not burn itself and its inhabitants up.
Andrew Shepard. This is the Converging Perspectives podcast.
Welcome back to the Converging Perspectives Codpiece. Welcome back to the Converging Perspectives podcast. I'm Andrew Shepard, and my guest is Rebecca Armstrong, professor and mythologist and theologian. In our last episode, we were really getting into these ideological frameworks and how they sort of bind and blind us, as Jonathan Haidt would say, into sort of sacred values and opinions that we can't see past. And I was describing some of these ideological frameworks that are sort of common, such as scientism, sort of a material reductionist philosophy that everything is ultimately reducible to matter, whatever that is. And therefore, anything that's magical or mystical must be untrue inherently, and we're not even going to consider it. There are other philosophies that go more into the political realm, such as liberal utopianism, which is sort of like a Star Trek vision, or libertarian utopianism, in which, sort of an Ayn Rand vision of you just let the market be free, everything would work out perfectly all by itself. And of course, the most dangerous ideology that sort of has us by the stranglehold right now, this sort of variation on Ayn Rand, which is what I like to call the Church of the Almighty Dollar, this obsession with more is always better, and technology will solve all the problems that we face from that. So, Rebecca, maybe you could talk a little bit about the historical roots of ideological frameworks in politics.
Well, we'll start with the kind of tongue-in-cheek opening line when philosophers get together, which is always, so are you Aristotelian or a Platonist? And there is this sort of belief that all of philosophy can be summed up as the eternal battle between Plato and Aristotle. That no matter where you're coming into the argument, you can ultimately define a philosopher by whether they are mostly in Plato's camp or mostly in Aristotle's camp. And it's kind of a useful way to approach things, even when we talk about contemporary politics, because both Plato and Aristotle are living in the same place at the same time and share a tremendous number of beliefs and values, right? They're both part of the grand experiment of Athenian democracy. And the fact that Aristotle is Plato's student goes a long way in explaining how you can have so many shared beliefs and yet arrive at such opposing viewpoints, which I think is going to be very useful for our conversation, because Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives are living in the same country. We have the shared belief that we all love the democratic principles of our national republic. We want to have a flourishing society, and yet there's tremendous animosity about the method, about how we arrive there. So just to start with that, Plato's idealism and Aristotle's empiricism is a way to track these two trains of thought. And in fact, there are some who will argue that it's actually a personality profile. That if you were raised the way Plato was raised, and if you have that kind of personality, you can't help but be a certain way. Right? And conversely, if you were Aristotle, you would have to end up thinking this way and having the beliefs you had. which is much in line with some contemporary psychologists who say, let me get your personality profile and I will predict accurately whether you're a liberal or a conservative. So there is something to be said for this idea of the cognitive profile and the direction it's going to take you in terms of your political beliefs.
Yeah, and maybe we should go into that a little bit more. I mean, what are the ideas that seem to track for rudimentary psychology and political outlook?
Well, I think the most important one for our conversation is the idea that Plato felt that the most important ideal is the individual, and that the government is actually important and useful and should be thoroughly integrated in order to give the individual the greatest opportunity for health, happiness, achievement, self-knowledge, etc. His idea of the philosopher king is the ultimate example of this. Government is good, and the people at the top of the government should be the philosophers, should be the thinkers. Aristotle was much savvier around human personality and said, no, the best government is the one that has the least intrusion. The unit that we're interested in is the family. The social capital of the family. That is where you want to put the power. And the government should be left out of it as much as possible. So in that sense, you can see how the liberal and conservative strands are going to trail out of those two belief systems.
Right. And we get to the point where today we have a real division between the conservative mindset, which is more about the family values, right, and sort of a domestic agenda, more of a smaller in-group, and liberals essentially are adhering to a global citizen, like a citizen of the world philosophy, much more like a Star Trek type of vision, which expands the in-group to include more people.
Well, I think that's going to become more and more the flashpoint for our conversation. It's where do you draw the circle of interest, intent, and importance? If you draw it around the individual as a sole actor, you have a very different moral matrix than if you draw it around the family or around the tribe, because
Right.
your moral imperatives are going to change. If you put on a pedestal individual rights as the single most important structural advantage that you want government to serve, that is going to look significantly different than if you put the family unit as that circle of interest, as the most important thing to protect and serve. If you put a larger tribe, that's going to have political ramifications. And I think right now what we're seeing to a large extent is that liberals are very, very concerned with the individual, with individual rights, with individual feelings, individual opportunity. And conservatives are still based largely in the family unit, with an almost miniature political hierarchy inside the family, where the father should be in the role of the king or the monarch, and then the woman, wife, mother underneath that, and the children underneath that at the bottom of the pyramid. And so a government which sets up laws to protect that unit of human flourishing is going to be very different. And I think a lot of our current arguments, for instance, around abortion, if you look at it through that lens, you can see immediately why the conservatives would support the current motion to outlaw abortion, that abortion actually works against that triangular hierarchy of the family, where the father ought to have the first and last say over what happens to his wife and offspring. So who does the law serve? It serves the father. It serves the men in their family configuration, the anti-abortion laws. It does not serve the individual. At the individual level, every individual woman wanting to have sovereignty over her body and her life is ill-served by the most recent pronouncements from the Supreme Court. But you can see there that there are values in both of these that are somewhat hidden, right? I don't hear a lot of talk about the family hierarchy being served by the new abortion ban. But it is. It's not just against women. It's for the supremacy of the male in his household and family hierarchy.
I could see some men disagreeing with that on an individual level, but I see what you're saying completely, that it's much more about holding
Structurally,
right.
it would serve that ideal.
Typically, when we start getting into conversations about specific political issues like this one, we get into very combative dialogue very quickly. People get hard line on one issue and they say, my body, my choice. There is no other consideration that needs to be done here. And then you can have conservatives going, that's ridiculous. There's so many other considerations to be had. And there's a logical inconsistency to that, because if you say my body, my choice, well, then you should also be saying that about other issues like vaccines. You know.
So now you've touched this underlying discontinuity of belief, the cognitive dissonance of belief. And that is certainly an interesting one. Why the liberals flocked to the vaccines, whereas the conservatives decided that they were the work of the devil and ought to be fought with everything they had in them.
And I would contend that many liberals are clinging to the my body, my choice argument because it seems like a strong argument, and they haven't really thought through the other arguments that they would have to employ if they gave that one up. There are individual rights built into the Constitution, and there's a social contract which reduces those individual rights. You may want freedom, but if you had absolute freedom, you would not have a society at all. You would have no government. It would be pure anarchy. And you would not be free because some warring group would enslave you, as history has shown. So it's always this balancing act between individual freedoms and the good of the group. It's a balancing act. With abortion and with vaccine issues, it's a balancing act of what's the social good? What's the social contract? What does the society need from us? How does that constrain our individual freedoms, and how much?
Right. And so again, if we go back to the abortion issue, which is so interesting because it allows us to see the cognitive inconsistencies in both the liberal and the conservative arguments. And you've just pointed out that for liberals, there is an inconsistency there because we also argue that you ought to give up some of your personal freedoms in order to support the good of society overall. But on the conservative side, this argument that it's the sanctity of life they're trying to support flies in the face of the conservative efforts to continue with capital punishment. The conservative belief in the death penalty is a direct affront to the idea that all life is sacred and should never be, taken away. It's also, and from the liberal perspective, a gross inconsistency that the states with the most rigid anti-abortion laws are factually the ones who spend the least on social services to support children, infants, mothers. They have the worst maternal death rates of any states. It's like, so how can you be talking about all this pro-life? You clearly are not putting your money where your mouth is. So there are hypocrisies on both sides, which suggests, and I think this is where you're coming to, that there are even deeper, more primal, intuitive, instinctual beliefs or values that people are actually operating from, which then seek to find an argument out there in the ethosphere of the media and sound bites in order to justify the position you've taken.
Yeah. And so Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist who works currently at NYU, is done the most work on this issue. And he's coined what we call moral foundations theory. And we may have mentioned this in the last episode, where he's basically broken it down. And maybe I'll just pop up the visual for our video viewers. So you can see that in moral foundations theory, Jonathan Haidt basically did massive research across different countries and cultures in order to find what are the most basic moral values that are consistently showing up in every society. And he found that basically 6 of them: the care harm principle, which means to care for others, basically compassion for others and to do no harm; fairness or cheating, which is just all human beings essentially want things to be fair and they hate cheating; loyalty or betrayal, people find loyalty to be a very good value in themselves and others, and they despise it when people are not loyal; authority and subversion, which means that If people have respect for authority, then the pyramid of structural society works. And if they don't, it falls apart and it's awful. And then there's the sanctity principle, which is also known as sort of the purity principle, which is to avoid contaminants. And this, of course, can sort of metastasize in very different ways depending on the cultural framework you're coming from. If you have a religion that frames certain people as dirty and others as clean, that creates a different order, or versus a value that all people are equally pure would create sort of the opposite reaction to exclusion. And then we have the liberty value, which Jonathan Haidt actually points out the other side of liberty is oppression. And so it's sort of an anti-oppression mentality. Any kind of oppression of people and their freedoms is wrong and awful. These values show up in the American psyche, but mostly with the liberals championing the compassion principle, the fairness principle, and the liberty principle the most, sort of ignoring the other three to a large extent, or even being against those three. You find that liberals are often disgusted by respect for authority, or a religious sense of purity is disgusting to liberals. And that sometimes loyalty, and I have to admit, I hold this too, loyalty to personhood can obfuscate justice or the truth. And I find that very irritating, because I find that I am more loyal to truth than I am to person or group. Although I am also loyal to persons and groups. It's just that when you find the cognitive dissonance of my group is telling me to agree with them on this thing that is wrong, I fight the constraints of that loyalty.
So these 6 moral values, which is what they are, and the amount of allegiance that any individual will pay to any one of these 6 values is fascinating. And essentially what you're doing is profiling someone's political personality based on which values they would move higher up in the hierarchy, right? And the fact that liberals push the care harm value to the very top, supported by the fairness and liberty values, is instructive. The fact that they don't care very much for loyalty, authority, and sanctity is interesting and maybe even curious until you realize that liberals have substituted other values for those. Liberals don't have personal loyalty because they've substituted personal interpretation of the facts. In a sense, they've substituted rationality.
Mm-hmm.
Liberals have a huge belief that reason can bring you to the answers you need, and loyalty be damned. If my leader says something that I know to be factually untrue, I'm going to call him on it. That's the liberal attitude. Whereas you see a lot more loyalty and willingness to overlook leaders making factual errors or contradicting themselves among Republicans, because personal loyalty still matters a lot more. So I wouldn't, because I think it's easy to go, wow, look, the conservatives have all 6 values that they cling to, but the liberals only have 3. My point is, liberals have substituted other values. Right? So for loyalty and authority, they've substituted their own authority and loyalty to reason. The sanctity or the purity principle is an interesting one because it's clearly very hardwired. It kept us from poisoning ourselves and hanging out with diseased persons, which is clearly the road to health and reproductive value, evolutionary advantage. But why would liberals have less value? Because liberals embrace open-mindedness, which is a personality characteristic of liberals and absolutely not of conservatives. That one personality quality can define you on the political spectrum.
Right.
Well, open-mindedness means I'm willing to eat snails. I'm willing to try eating a chocolate-covered grasshopper. Sure. The level of disgust has just dropped way down because we've imposed the quality of open-mindedness on our experience.
And we've even socially trained ourselves in the liberal communities to be open-minded. It's like, hey, it's not okay for you to prejudge those strangers. It's not okay for you to prejudge that food before you've tried it. You know, it's like there's this strong anti-closed-mindedness within the liberal culture, which at times could be argued goes too far, where it's like we're denying our own human nature at times by saying, no, you must be accepting of all these new strangers, even if their culture is completely foreign to you and they're violent and all these other things that actually scare you at a physiological, biological, instinctive level. Screw all of your instincts, do what we say, be open-minded. It's like, Argh. And that's, I think, where a lot of the fight comes in with the conservatives, is they're not willing to override their instincts with rationality that has not been fully sold to them as worth it.
Mhm.
The other thing I think is really important that you just mentioned was about the rationality sort of substituting for authority and loyalty. And this is not to say that conservatives are not rational at all, but Roger Scruton even said he feels that conservatism is essentially to be able to articulate why you don't need reasons, that there are inherent instinctive values that we don't need to question and justify rationally, that they just are. And that's fine to a certain point. But when you have things like the civil rights movement and slavery, which instinctively people were able to hold on to those values for a long freaking time before actually changing it. And even after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, it was going on almost 100 years of Black people supposed to have the same rights and privileges as white people and not having them. And that's why the civil rights movement happened in the 1960s. And it still was a huge battle that literally divided the country and turned the South into Republicans and the North into Democrats. I mean, it polarized and switched polarities of the political parties. And that's such a big deal. And it's all around, I think, this same issue where liberals have championed something that conservatives don't appreciate, which is that sometimes you have to think through and past your own instincts, or you are doing harm. You are doing evil. And this is clearly seen in social psychology with the very basis of tribalism. And this is where liberals have good arguments against authority and loyalty. Because so many times in recent history, we've seen authoritarian leaders rise to power and oppress or murder people by beating the tribal drum and getting people to go, yeah, us, not them. You have to think against some of these instincts. You cannot just rely on what feels right all the time. I think that's the argument.
But the other side of the argument is that liberals overvalue cognition and overvalue reason and leave out the importance of the instinctual feelings of tradition. And this is what the conservatives would say, that if you've lifted up on a pedestal the idea of reason, you're missing 90% of what actually motivates humans. And so your quest is doomed to fail because you will always be up against the reality of human beings. There's this really dark saying, I can't remember now whose quote it is. In war and work, age and cunning will always triumph over youth and idealism. Which is what a conservative will say. It's like, look at the evidence here. This is how things really are. So go ahead and have your idealistic reasons about why we should do things differently, but I will take the lower path here of how humans actually work.
Right. And I think that this in the political realm, and I think political scientists have pointed this out, this is where Democrats keep failing, is that they're working from this assumption that everyone appeals to these same sort of liberal paradigm worldviews, and that's not true. And I think that is probably why Trump won and the Democrats and most news organizations didn't believe it was possible.
Here's something else that just occurred to me. There may be an alliance of the time frame with conservative values. Conservatives are the tradition bearers, right? They're the ones who are always hearkening back to yesterday and what the traditions are and how good it was. Whereas liberals are always pushing into the future. As idealists, we're always looking for what could be better, hold the vision, the promise of what's ahead. So if we take that as a timeline and look at the role of reason for conservatives versus liberals, liberals may err on the side of not having a long enough view. As just a sort of a starting point, one little piece of evidence that I came across yesterday, I was researching cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. It's the new standard for psychological intervention. Whatever ails you, get some CBT. And cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially reworking the frame around your reality in order to be able to deal with it. And it has startlingly effective results, but they only last for about 12 months. This is what we're now seeing. It's a short time frame. You can reframe your reality and feel more hopeful and make a few tweaks and get over the initial hump, but you will sink back to the same level of despair and dissatisfaction after 12 months. So it doesn't have the staying power as the longer psychoanalysis, where you go back into the past. You look at early traumas, childhood experiences, shadow issues, da, 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 da. In other words,
Right.
if you're only operating in this immediate now into the very short-term future, thinking is a useful tool. If you are actually talking about a lifetime or the continuation of a community, you need more than rationality.
That makes a lot of sense. So we're saying that liberals have this sort of beautiful utopian vision of how things could be, which is exactly what a pathfinder needs, right? Is a vision of where we're going and not just, I don't like what we currently have. But that psychologists would call that a useful fiction, right? That's like, this is a useful fiction. It's probably not going to be this way, but this is how we're envisioning it. And the usefulness of the fiction is that we try to expand our in-group by thinking in this way. And by expanding our in-group, we become less tribalistic, less fearful and attacking of people who are in our own society. And so it's useful in that sense because we can build the UN, we can build, multilateral agreements with other countries. And sometimes those things are quite good. Sometimes those things prevent nuclear holocausts from occurring, right? So there's a lot of good in that useful fiction, but ultimately it is still a fiction. We need to remind ourselves, particularly liberals, of that from time to time, that it's not reality, at least not yet.
We are living right now in one of the critical moments of the useful fiction of ecological advances as a global enterprise. We're asking all countries to come together and step into that shared vision of a working planet that does not burn itself and its inhabitants up. But it requires each of those nations to make national sacrifices in order to serve the greater cause. So this is an absolutely prime example of where the useful fiction is essential. And I don't think that there are any of those environmental activists and visionaries who don't have that liberal, platonic presence of mind to say, we have got to get a vision or we're all going to perish.
Right.
And yet we know that national interests, our own conservatives, even some of our right-leaning Democrats in Congress, have been giving us a hard time about getting on the bandwagon for ecological sanity because they saw that it might hurt us as a nation. In other words, our tribe might have to bear too much of the cost, so I'm not going to sign on. And that's always the danger, that the tribe will say, yeah, it's a great vision, and I see that we're all going to suffer if we don't work collectively, but damn it, my sacrifice will be too great, so I'm not going to go along.
And of course, the problem with this is sometimes that it's a much smaller group than just the nation. We're talking about a particular state or a particular company. These people are going to lose money, therefore we can't vote for the thing that is the morally correct thing to do.
In this sense, what liberals and ecological activists are doing is actually taking the loyalty value and trying to tweak it by giving us images of planet Earth, by trying to appeal to our sense of being earthly, of being global participants. And there's a lot of buy-in to that idea from some unexpected places too. The libertarians who happen to be digital nomads can flourish in that kind of a loyalty, right? Yeah, I want a planet where I can go and do my work from anywhere. Any beach on this planet will be good enough for me.
Yeah, I feel like in a way this issue of globalism needs to be communicated and framed in a healthier way, because what's been happening is that conservatives have literally been just afraid of the whole concept of globalism. A lot of conspiracy theories have been spawned around fear of globalism and any kind of trilateral agreements about how the world should be moving forward is seen as inherently dangerous to the individuals within the country. A lot of conservative politics of late in America have been very anti-UN and anti-international climate accords. It's just very much like us and them, and we don't want to do anything that empowers them, even if it's part of us. And so like seeing us as sort of Russian dolls or concentric circles of inclusion would be really healthy, right? To say like, okay, this is me, this is my family, this is my inner group, this is my state, my country, and this is my world, my international community. And certain things that hurt the international community will inherently hurt me. Every little concentric circle around me will be hurt if this damage happens to the collective. And this is, I think, what's so important is getting to a sense of systemic thinking, which I don't think liberals or conservatives seem to have really mastered today, is to understand that the ecology of things, that everything is interdependent, everything is connected, and that if we choose to benefit or damage something over here and assume it's not going to have ramifications that come back to haunt us is foolish.
You know, the instinct to distrust and be suspicious of ever expanding and ever more powerful systems is hardwired into us, and for good reason. I mean, all you have to do is read history to see how many times those world conquerors began imposing laws that were more and more oppressive and onerous on the smallest, most vulnerable members of a population until their empires were overthrown. I mean, this is the history of the world, is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there is good reason for us to be suspicious. We can look, at Stalin's great ideals for making Russia so self-sufficient and food and factories for everyone, and the horrific purges and deaths in the tens of thousands, if not millions, that followed that, or the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I mean, it's so recent. We've seen these atrocities, and you could say, well, but ecological, global sanity to keep us from burning ourselves up, that's not maniacal. That makes perfect sense. Yes, but once you have the structure in place where a small group of people can dominate millions, it's inherently dangerous. As human beings, we need to remain absolutely conscious of that all the time and allow for the conservatives to hold that one end of the tightrope.
Right. Of course, I don't see either side of the aisle actually doing good work to decentralize power.
For certain global issues, you can't decentralize. It makes no sense. The only way to understand climate change and deal with it is through a centralized data converging analysis and strategies that are then shared across the globe. That's the only way to deal with it in a practical sense. So how do you then decentralize the power to make sure that happens? A very tricky problem.
Yeah.
A wicked problem.
You know what I'd like to do is go into the sort of core liberal values, and just like we did with Roger Scruton and the conservative values, and showing how useful they are, how good they are in the dialogue, I'm going to go through the liberal values and show, praise for what's really good about liberal perspectives on things. White privilege is a term that's thrown around now, and it almost feels like a weapon now. But originally, it's based in this concept that white people who are living in a middle-class life, they don't witness the plight of African Americans in inner city environments that are fiercer and have fewer resources, and the educational system is not really set up to their advantage. And so it's easy for white people to go through life without noticing all the damage going on around their society when they're just hidden in the little suburbs, you know? And so you have to be educated in order to understand this is happening to people and it's damaging our entire group. It's very bad and it needs to be handled. If you just stayed in an instinctive state, you never would. And I think that's what was happening, is that people were like, well, I'm happy. We're doing all right. Aren't black people doing better too? It's like, sometimes no. And so I think that the whole civil rights movement sprung up because white people realized, oh my gosh, this isn't okay. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X are making strong points, and we didn't realize this, and now we do, and we're going to change it. So that's a really great thing that liberals champion. It may have caused a lot of chaos and unrest, but for good reason.
Well, I don't think there's any debate that well-intentioned, awakened white liberals were a critical factor in the civil rights movement, in pushing things forward. I mean, Martin Luther King was very clear. He recognized the important role of all those nice white liberals in their suburban churches who sent busloads of people to march with him in Alabama and Mississippi. Without their help, without their dollars, without their advocating and lobbying in state and federal governments, things would not have moved. They would not have changed. You need those people and their awokeness to move the wheels because they have so much of the power. So many of their hands are on those wheels.
A lot of conservatives have argued, or libertarians, would have argued, if the history weren't so clear, that self-interest should be enough, that if black people are suffering, they should fight and voice their claims and say, these are problems that are hurting me. I want it to be changed, and that should go through the democratic system and things would change. But they didn't for a century. That's where that argument does not hold up.
That's right. That's right. And so when you look at that long American history of the struggle for true emancipation and equality, you find that the liberal groups in the North remain active and remain significant through the Underground Railroad, through the Civil War, through the whole Reconstructionist period, because they recognize that things, when you are that broken and that vulnerable, you can't mobilize to overturn things. You've got to be there with people who are strong enough to open up their hands. And the linked arms was a key image for that whole movement.
And just to have a voice that's respected, to not be shot down because the majority doesn't want to hear your voice.
Well, the struggle for gay rights, for gay marriage, all of that, it's not just the people who are gay who managed to overturn those laws. It was their family members and their friends and their colleagues who were willing to go to the line with them. So this is where the moral value of care and liberty and fairness converge, come together to form really socially active individuals who are operating out of their key value systems to make change in the world around them. So this is where idealism is actually an engine. It works, it moves things, it changes things on the ground. It goes from idealism to making things real that were not before.
Right. And we may see some extremes in it today where you have a wokeness that is essentially all about virtue signaling and not about action. And yeah, we can criticize that for sure. But this all metastasized during the civil rights movement, and who is going to argue against that at this point? So speaking about fairness, I would go into the next liberally charged value. There's a lot of statistical evidence that shows societies that have more equality tend to be happier, and that societies that tend to be less equal have more crime and have just generally less satisfaction of the people. Whenever you have wealth and poverty sort of right across the border from each other, you have a lot more animosity and actual crime.
Yeah, I think human beings cannot help but compare themselves to other members of their own species. This is just like an innate habit that we have. We're always looking over our shoulder to see what somebody else has. And the more like us they are, the more we can compare ourselves to them and feel slighted or angry if they've got more than we do. This is part of human nature that needs to be taken into account.
Right.
Which is why certain kinds of movements are having such a hard time, like affirmative action. Because liberals can look at their children and say, well, my children are just as deserving as those children. Why should those children get more of an advantage in school enrollment than my child? It's a two-way street, again, depending on how big you're going to draw the circle of us.
Right. And how much you're going to think about what equality is. And of course, Jonathan Haidt has pointed out this whole issue with equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. And when you try to force equality of outcome, you're inherently imbalancing the scales to a point where it actually can damage the meritocracy, which is the other side of the coin of this, right? Of the people who are the most talented are not allowed to get ahead or not allowed to really show off how talented they are. And that actually hurts society collectively.
It does, but also individually. You know, in classrooms where the teacher goes around and gives every child a gold star, that gold star has no value. And the children will simply dismiss it. They pay no attention to it anymore because they instinctively know it doesn't mean anything. It's not attached to anything that's observable or measurable.
If the standard of the college system is to get everybody through it so that you have a piece of paper that says you're smart and qualified, and then they keep reducing the standards of education to get people through because they need the money and they don't want to hurt the ego of the students, well, then you've created a society of people with pieces of paper that mean nothing, and they're really not that good at their jobs, and they're not very good thinkers.
Well, we're almost there already. Right? I mean, having a BA is almost meaningless now because it still doesn't mean that you know how to write a coherent sentence or analyze a paragraph that's been sent to you in the email and make sense of it. And when that is the truth, bosses are not going to care whether you've got a degree or not. They're going to find other ways to measure your ability for those basic kinds of tasks. So your $35,000 investment to get a BA is going to mean diddly squat. So there's a comeuppance. There's definitely a dark thread in that behavior.
Another thing you already mentioned about what liberals have been pushing for is around gay marriage, and now we're into transgender rights and such. And these things are really triggering for people in the Christian right who view these things kind of in a very morally framed way of just not good or somehow immoral. And it's a challenge for those people to deal with this. But one could argue that the liberal agenda around this, again, has been a very psychologically beneficial thing, at least those individuals who have been being oppressed by society unknowingly to most of society. It may, again, cause some turmoil or shifting to have transgender bathrooms. It's like, what a pain in the ass. Like, yeah, but for some people, this is going to be really helpful for them. And to ignore their cause is a little heartless, as a liberal would say.
So the transgender women in sports issue is another wonderful convergence of differing efforts on the part of liberals to advance minorities who have suffered oppression, right? And the liberals love finding minorities who've suffered oppression and advancing them. So we had the group of women in sports, an oppressed group until Title IX came along to give money to sports and education. And then you have the transgender. But suddenly they've met in this unexpected but really difficult place where transgender women are now competing against biological women in sports and in some cases beating them with an unfair advantage, say some people, because they still have the advantages of having had all that testosterone for the first couple decades of their life, and they will always be taller and broader shouldered and blah, 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 blah. So this is a perfect place to look at how these values clash. For conservatives, it's not as problematic because they don't like transgender. They think that there's something evil about the whole idea that you can own your own body rather than your body is a gift from God. You take it as it was given to you by God and deal with it, right? And be grateful. Whereas liberals are like, hey, technology allows us to follow the inclinations of our heart and psychology. Why shouldn't we change the outward package if that's how we feel inside? Great, technology lets us do that. But in this clash of trans women in sports, you have the clash of two values which seem to be equally important to liberals, which is allowing the individual in whatever guise they appear in their lifetime in this planet to achieve their full potential. So you have biological women who are trying to achieve their full potential as athletes coming up against other individuals wanting to find their full potential and thereby, quote, depriving of biological women of their opportunity. So clearly this isn't all right. You can't have one group depriving another group of its opportunity.
And the danger of this has been pointed out by conservatives that if you are always championing a smaller and smaller minority group that's at the lowest level of society, they're trying to prop them up as much as possible, what you create is a reverse dominance hierarchy eventually, in which basically merit is at the bottom and the people who are most deprived or challenged are at the top of the pecking order. A lot of people could argue that that's a very dysfunctional society, that's not going to benefit the whole group at all.
And you can see that liberals would like to do that. We would like to have more Head Start programs in neighborhoods of reduced opportunity, neighborhoods of poverty. We would love to throw money at that. And in fact, to do so, we have actually canceled programs for the gifted that flourished in big cities and suburbs. So the question is that advantageous to society in the long run?
Right.
Or, as you're suggesting, is that turning things on their head, that we're depriving the best and brightest of the opportunity to give their full talents back to their society?
We really do need to somehow contain in our minds the meritocracy and its overall importance to society, because it's not in the moral foundations theory, right? But it's very important to everybody, is meritocracy. The foundation of fairness is built on, well, who's competent, who's really good at these things. Like, you have to start there or you don't even have a basis to judge what is fair. There was a great example of the Women's March on D.C. I heard about where basically there were black women in the Women's March basically telling white women to shut up. And this is time for you to be quiet. But it wasn't a black women's march, it was a women's march. And it became sort of hijacked by the racial agenda. And some people let that happen. But it was very upsetting to women who had a lot of grievances of their own to express, white women, you know? So it's like there
will always be the competing of oppressed minorities. I mean, this goes back to a very famous debate between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass. Beautiful history. It's just marvelous to read their letters to each other over this long period of time where they're both struggling for emancipation and recognition as full citizens. And Frederick Douglass is the champion of women's rights and comes and speaks at their rallies. And the women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton go and speak at rallies for the emancipation of the American Negro, as they were called at the time. But then when push comes to shove, when they get actual traction in government, Frederick Douglass urges them to remove the clause about women's suffrage, because otherwise, he says, the bill won't pass. Right. And black men, quote, are suffering more than white women. Of course, the women are appalled because all along he has been equating their struggles as united, that we are two groups of important Americans. Neither of us has the right to vote yet. We deserve it. Our causes are the same. And when push comes to shove, he abandons them. Years later, he acknowledges in a letter to Elizabeth Cady Stanton that he was wrong. He should not have uncoupled those two progressive social causes. That in fact, it might have been possible to get both passed. It might have delayed the passage of the bill by some years or even by many years. But if it's the same cause and it's the same reason, it is dangerous to uncouple them. And I think that's what we're looking at here, right? That if the Black women are saying white women should be silent, it's not your turn anymore. We have suffered more, therefore we should be moved to the front of the line and our voices should be heard. They're missing the point that Frederick Douglass made, which is if your claim and cause is the same and driven by the same principle of justice, then it's not a different claim. I don't care what color you are. It's not a different claim. I don't care what gender you are. It's the same claim. It's an individual's claim for justice under the laws of the land. And this is a hard thing to suggest, right? My saying it as a white woman may have a different ring than if a Black woman said that right now. Let's listen to what Frederick Douglass said. He said, no, you both have the same claim. But is it not true that right now all women are being equally affected by the anti-abortion laws that are suddenly changing overnight women's expectations of how much autonomy and sovereignty they have over their lives in this country? It doesn't matter the color of your skin. You will be prosecuted in Texas and Alabama regardless of your ethnicity. So it is a shared fight.
We're talking about logical inconsistencies, and we're talking about sort of Kant's argument that the ends do not justify the means. It's like you have to be logically consistent, or down the road you are doomed to be working at cross purposes with yourself.
Right. Because in a sense, if you take principle off the table in order to be more effective, as Frederick Douglass did by cutting out the women's suffrage piece from the bill and supporting, a different bill, you are doing a disservice, in a sense, to your own character. You're saying, I'm willing to cut corners. I'm willing to make deals. I am willing to let the ends justify the means and take means that are less than what I would feel really good about were I consistent and honorable and truthful to my highest conviction.
You're also basically challenging your own issue. If your issue is a logical cause and it's not a tribal issue, then you've sort of undermined it. And you're saying, well, no, it's really about me and my group.
Exactly. Right. And that's what Douglass saw.
On this issue of trans and homosexual rights and whatnot, there's another caveat that I think people often miss. It's not just about these groups, these small minority groups, and their cause and their freedom and their lack of oppression. It's what we're really doing here, which is what really triggers Christian conservatives too, is we're challenging structural notions of gender identity and sexuality and its constraints. I think that by doing so, it's actually a potential individual liberating force for everybody. Everybody who challenges their sense of what I'm supposed to wear as a man is now freer to wear something more playful. Everyone who challenges their sexuality is now free to experiment just a little bit more in the bedroom. This is a leavening of our culture. And of course, some people are scared so badly of that leavening, but it is essentially more freedom being offered. And that's the byproduct of championing these minority groups and their causes that I think is often unexpressed. But it's rooted in the liberal ideology, right? Of individual freedom is more important than collective expectations being easy to predict, right?
There's a magnificent book. It's like 300 or 400 pages called Biological Exuberance, which systematically goes through hundreds of species and points out that they all have sexual diversity and gender diversity. It's like, this is not perverse. You can't possibly call this perverse or anti-natural when nature itself, without the possibility of further discussion, has always created enough diversity that homosexuality, right, same gender sexuality is part of the way it's made us.
Right.
as planetary creatures. It's a marvelous book. It probably did overkill of a number of examples, but it needed to, right? Because we still have large groups of people saying that it's unnatural. This book simply puts that argument to rest. It is not unnatural.
Yeah. And the Kinsey reports did that to some degree back in the 60s through surveys of seeing how sexually fluid people are throughout their lifetimes. It's again another call for both liberals and conservatives to understand our nature better. Because when we don't understand that nature works on spectrums, not in strict categories, then we're really fighting reality.
And this would be a nod to the conservative tradition bearer. We are seeing the problems that society has when it attempts to transition from a dominant understanding of how the genders are supposed to work together towards an unpinned whirlwind of possibility. How do we put family life together when we can't rely on each other to pick up the social cues of what men are supposed to do and what women are supposed to do and how children ought to behave? All of these cross-referential hierarchy decisions that society had made for us and that we could just step into the role, knowing what the script was, suddenly the script is gone, and yeah, there will be a lot of turmoil. So in that sense, the conservatives are absolutely right. There is turmoil, and it is a result of the loosening of the expectations and the gender definitions. But to say that it is evil is to miss the point that we are a constantly evolving species. And when we've got this many billions of Homo sapiens on the planet, maybe that in our innate wisdom of biological adaptation, we're trying to promote a sexuality that has the benefits of companionship and social cooperation without the number of offspring that we have traditionally had. Biologically, this could be an evolutionarily good thing for fewer children to be brought into the world, where we still can enjoy partnerships that solidify society.
Any kind of depopulation talk seems to trigger conspiracy theorists to get very excited about the culling of the human population.
That's tribalism. The culling of the human population seems to be happening at the top of the spectrum with less white babies every year. So, if that's the us you're interested in, you're going to be triggered and you're going to be afraid, and you're going to try to create social laws that are going to support your in-group, like anti-abortion laws for all the women in my state. I have no problem seeing the motivation there.
I feel like the liberal value system is really fascinating and important. There's a couple more I wanted to mention. I just wanted to rattle them off quickly. But like the shrinking middle class has become a major issue for really the progressives, even sort of the extremes of the left wing, if you will, like the Bernie Sanders group. To point out, the middle class has been shrinking for decades while the wealthier get wealthier. And that is inherently unfair, and it is creating a problem for us collectively. But the idea of redistributing wealth is seen as evil by people on the right. Like it's straight up socialism. It will be the scourge of all civilization. If that happens, it will destroy democracy. If you look just back at post-World War II, the tax rate was incredibly high on the wealthiest people. That didn't destroy democracy then. Human civilization has been social for all of human civilization. There's been a socialist component to groups that the weakest members of society, unless you're Spartan, are not murdered. They're not left for dead unless you can't afford to keep them. And so in a society that has resources, you take care of people. People are not refused medical care by the witch doctor in ancient tribal society, nor are they refused education or a job of some sort just because they're not the most able. There's always this sort of socialist kind of caring principle in human civilization to some degree. And so that balancing act is, again, what we need to be talking about. Where's the balancing act between social programs and meritocracy?
Yeah, the loss of the middle class is dangerous on so many levels. The middle class is the group that holds the values of a society in a kind of stasis. They're absolutely essential for the equilibrium and flourishing of a society. I mean, it's the middle class that will take all of the jobs that are the maintenance and slow growth jobs of society. The rich have other concerns and won't take certain kinds of work. The very, very poor can take rudimentary jobs, but they're not educated for some of those mid-level jobs. So there's a huge gap in the economic engine, which is very, very dangerous. And we're already seeing some of that problem right now. The other problem, of course, politically, is that the concerns of the rich are to maintain, protect, and control their wealth. And they are willing, able, and eager to do whatever it takes to protect their wealth, and will use their wealth to do so, which is why you have the lobbies and the tax law advantages that middle-class people can't even figure out how to read and don't have the money to hire someone smart enough to make them understand, and wouldn't be able to take advantage of it even if they could read it and understand. I mean, it's hardwired to push the divide greater and greater. There's a wonderful image that I'm going to send you to include here, which is just two graphs. One says unequal division of wealth, France, 1780. Unequal division of wealth, America, 2020. And it's just these two graphs. And the unequal division of wealth in America, 2020, is greater than the unequal division of wealth in France, 1780. And you might say, well, what's the point of these two graphs? Well, students of history will know that shortly after the graph that represents France in the end of the 18th century, we had the Reign of Terror, where more than 17,000 aristocrats had their heads chopped off, in the public guillotine, because the French peasants had just had enough of the aristocracy. So the fact that we are even beyond that in America now, the wealth disparity is even greater, should be a warning to us that we are in severe political distress. And if we don't know how to read history, we could very well see a repeat of what's happened in the past when things get this out of hand. Anybody who needs to know more should read Thomas Piketty.
Thomas Piketty really set the deal here on understanding these rises and falls of economic disparity. The question is more important than the facts, in a way. Why are liberals so against the wealthy? And the conservatives, who are not wealthier than the liberals, are not. Why, indeed, is that the situation? Is it because liberals are less cohesive as a group somehow, and therefore harder for the wealthy elite to influence, and the conservatives are a little bit more instinctive and therefore somewhat more easy to manipulate? Or is it that liberals have this inherent anti-classism or no, it's like the conservatives have that too. Conservatives hate classism. Why has this been the division that we've seen? And that poor conservatives are supporting billionaire politicians and conglomerates?
This could be one of those dark veils that you have to lift up to see the darkest of the psychological cognitive dissonances, because what you're pointing to is true and very puzzling. Why are conservatives so against taxing the rich and trying to bring the money down into the flow of the community, whereas liberals and progressives are all about tax the rich, let's mix it up? And I think part of it could be defined as another political value, which is let the chips fall where they may, which is akin to the authority of God. Something has been set in motion. We shouldn't touch it. Let it play itself out, which in a sense is a conservative mindset.
Well, it's a libertarian mindset. It's the libertarian utopianism, which has flaws in its actual how it runs. Not a legitimate philosophy for governing, because it would exclude government.
So you could say that it's on the farthest extreme of conservatism. It's, the best government is no government at all. So whatever is happening, just allow it to play itself out. That would be the best way for us to live, is without any kind of governmental intervention in our lives.
It's akin to natural law theory. It's a sort of this natural law principle of, well, just let nature run its course. It will do much better than we could possibly do. And that's where I just say, like, libertarianism is 90% correct, but that other 10% could kill us all.
In very rare cases, have we actually had large swaths of people who decided to do without government. The more people you have trying to coexist in a geographic space, the more government becomes necessary. And obviously so. Little groups of people who band together, and they're always trying to band together until they get too fractious, and then they'll have a civil war and become two. But usually it's a banding together for strength, as we did when we came together as United States in order to defend ourselves against the tyrant overseas.
Which, of course, has led us to a great crisis of identity today when we are the greatest empire in the world. Last value I want to point out of that liberals champion far more than conservatives, even though they shouldn't, is that of the environment, that liberals are much more focused on cleaning the environment. It's the purity principle applied, the very principle that liberals reject around religious grounds, they have adopted as far as the environment is concerned, as far as nature is concerned. They want that to be pure and clean, and that is sacred.
Well, you can see that history in this country because deism, which was the theology of many of the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, adopted nature as the central icon of its theology. It was not the white bearded God in the sky. And as a country, America was ideally suited to play with this new theology of nature as the very expression of divinity. So you had people like Emerson and Thoreau feeding gorgeous language into this theology of the God of nature. So in fact, if you read American religious history, the God of nature is the main new religion. That is our new religion, is the God of nature. So what I'm hearing you say is that, yes, in the South, there are pockets of conservative Christianity for whom the God on high, the enthroned God in the sky, the God of Ten Commandments and rules is still the operative principle. But for most Americans who've thrown out the trappings of old school religion, God of nature is where it's at. And they don't even use the word God anymore. But nature is sacred. Yes, now we can agree nature is good. Nature blesses us. Nature provides. Therefore, nature is the new thing that we must circle around to worship and celebrate. And you can see that in our cultural norms now. Burning Man in California is the perfect expression of the new religion, right?
Yeah, except that Burning Man is a tiny minority group as far as the culture is concerned at large. Well, we may be saying and not taking a nod to nature, but underneath that, we're still beholden to this other unspoken religion of the almighty dollar, of greed, of more is better. And that's the only reason we haven't passed any meaningful climate change legislation on either the right or the left side, even though the left is championing it more than the right. And the right is actively cutting it down for profit, right? For the sake of big business and our group making more. Neither party has made it a big enough deal to make any significant change. It's basically worship of nature, virtue signaling only.
Well, it feels to me as if it's deeper than virtue signaling. I think there is a seriousness of intent and a genuineness from the emotional body in what I can hear, see, feel, read in other people. I think that for many, many Americans, this is a central concern and that they are willing to put their money where their mouth is. The problem is that at the individual level, there's not enough weight to turn the political wheels. You need the government to force businesses to also start weighing in on that side. And that's where the real fight, the real tension is.
And you need the people to elect the government to do so. Yuval Noah Harari recently put a team together, where I'm sure they were resourced with climate scientists, and they determined that basically a 2% spending of GDP from each nation would curb climate change, would literally stop it in its tracks. That's less than we spent bailing ourselves out of the financial crisis in 2008, which was 3.5% of our GDP. So it's totally doable. We just don't have the will to do it.
how big was that recent bill that Manchin and Schumer just got through the Senate?
385 billion.
Okay, so that's
Not
significant. I don't know if it's 2%, but it's
and
certainly an important step in the right direction.
And it also opens up drilling in several states, including Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. Really offset compromise there.
Some away. Yeah.
Some climate scientists are saying it will actually completely offset any reduction in emissions that the good in the bill does. We're really still stuck on this issue. And what's funny to me is that conservatives can't see it as a moral value, even though Republicans were the champion of this. Now, again, Republicans before they were the conservative party, right? But Teddy Roosevelt, he did all the national parks work. I mean, he was a great lover of nature. He thought it was very important to preserve our nature. And then Nixon, as many flaws as he had as a president, he is the one who passed the Clean Air and Water Act, which gave the EPA its power initially, and it's been largely stripped away by conservative justices. But in any case, this is a major issue, and liberals currently are the ones championing it the most, not as much as the Green Party, of course, but good luck getting the Green Party into office. Liberals know in some cases what needs to happen for the future of society, but the way they're trying to implement it is psychologically unaware and highly problematic. It's causing more pushback than progress. A lot of the liberal agenda is using this sort of whack-a-mole cancel culture as its tool for forcing these changes to happen. And what does whack-a-mole do? It puts the mole back underground so it can surface somewhere else. It makes no meaningful change ever. And I think that's arguably what we've been seeing, that there's not been change. Obviously, this idea of color blindness can work when you get children at a young age to be in mixed groups and whatnot and to not see race and not to be taught white supremacy. There's validity to that. But obviously, the systemic nature of racism is such that it's not fightable in these simplistic hammering ways. You have to educate the entire population. Moments of racism need to be met with teaching rather than shame. Or you basically knock it underground and create a backfire effect and an anti-movement to your movement.
Well, the use of shame as a social tool, you're right, that was reserved for conservatives. I mean, the first time that the Me Too movement reared up to drag down Harvey Weinstein, I was reminded of the Hawthorne novel, The Scarlet Letter, where Hester Prynne has to wear this huge scarlet A to show that she's an adulteress. And the use of shame in that tightly knit religious community to control the population. Very conservative. So it's a conservative tool, is shame. And yet suddenly it had been adopted by the women's movement and the far left to shame men before a trial, before the proper process of bringing evidence and hearing testimony and being judged by your peers. And that was shocking to me, absolutely shocking, that we had just jumped over that whole commitment to the process of due procedure towards justice and had retreated to what I consider to be a very conservative weapon, which is the use of public shaming.
It is literally mob rule. I mean, it was literally the court of public opinion ruling on his entire business and career. His business was bankrupted before he was ever legally charged with anything. Like, it was, his whole life was over before he ever saw a day in court. He looks pretty guilty, right? You know, but and that matters. The ultimate guilt matters. But the precedent set by that is really dangerous. And Jonathan Haidt suggests that this started in the university system, this prevalence for basically canceling people's voices because their free speech is violence against me as a minority, that clause was sort of enacted in universities around 2014. And then Jonathan Haidt says it was a dramatic shift in the university system. It was like in 1 year, suddenly teachers were being reprimanded for asking questions that were not as sensitive to minority issues as they should be, and discussions were being shut down in universities. And he connects it to the internet. And he talks about the Tower of Babel, this idea that we're becoming a global world. We can speak to people in different languages, but when we're doing that, all of a sudden there's this huge clash and we now can no longer understand each other. Basically, we switched from we care in academia about asking tough questions and getting to the truth and hearing lots of perspectives to my issue is so important that you're not allowed to speak. You're not allowed to say that contrary thing because it hurts me.
I think we should do a whole podcast on the origins of cancel culture, because I see a whole thread here on the rise of social media as a sixth column, as a use of public space as a new power tool or weapon in the hands of the least among us, right? That suddenly there's a huge population at the bottom that recognizes they've got something that's like a Molotov cocktail. And by God, they're going to use it. So it's a power play, because up to that point, we didn't know that it could be that useful and get such immediate results. And the minute you recognize that you're holding something that is that powerful, there's an urge, you want to use it, right? It's like, wow, this is great. This is a wonderful new arrowhead or new spear. Let me go kill something.
Of course, I've been thinking about the internet or social media as sort of the new tool that religion used to be. You know, it's like religion is this powerful social tool created to basically manipulate minds in a particular way. And somewhat responsible people originally set up those religious principles and seemingly maintained them for the good of society to pass forward knowledge and maintain a cultural consistency, and that those religious institutions have been failing in a lot of ways in the last century. They've been sort of falling apart and losing respect. And now we have technology creating social media, which is sort of not only triumphing, but taking the place of what religion used to do, without anybody holding the reins at all.
So this, I think, is the most critical piece, that we had religion. Religion was our tribal identity, and we all subscribed to the same beliefs and shared the same icons and knew the same songs and practices. When religion withdraws as the basic orientation for social life and the individuals, there's this huge vacuum. So in a sense, all Americans are yearning to identify with some group. We need that. We need a group identity. We can't be without it. It's like running naked, alone on the savannah. We're terrified of that. But what social media has done is to basically say, well, there's really ultimately only two camps. You're either going to go in this direction or in that direction, and we're happy to guide you and build up your sense of identity. So the minute you give us a clue which side you're going to, we are going to boost and boost and boost until you are so enmeshed in your corner that there is no actual opportunity for you to think outside that system of belief. So it's really that inexorable threading of the band that you have chosen to march with until you don't hear anything else. There's only that song playing. You are a one-track mind now. There's no getting out of it. And once you're in that, the tribal identity becomes the most important thing to defend. And so now you're into the cognitive biases, or the bind and blind problem that Jonathan Haidt pointed out, that once you've identified with your group, everything in your mind is now in service of holding that identity, protecting that identity, trying to dismiss the cognitive dissonances that we've been discussing, right? These weird hypocrisies, or why in the world would you believe that when you say your principle is this? Those kinds of cognitive abysses that in ordinary times would cause distress to the individual are simply shoved down, like the whack-a-mole, shoved down into the unconscious, because we can't deal with how uncomfortable it makes us. George Orwell, in his very, very famous book, 1984, had a chillingly but very effective definition of how this is done. Once they have got hold of you, And he called it doublethink, the ability to erase cognitive dissonance by indulging in doublethink. He says, to know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which cancel out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to believe that democracy is impossible, but that the party is the guardian of democracy, to forget whatever again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly forget that again, and above all, to apply the same process to the process. That is the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness. And then, once again, to be unconscious of the act of hypnosis you have just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involves the use of doublethink. It's just a brilliant summary of what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Because what we are in right now is the grip of liberal and conservative doublethink. And they have got us downplaying all of our cognitive dissonance in order to agree and fit in and be part of the tribe we've subscribed to.
Detachment from reality is what it is. It's like a willful detachment from reality.
And your own thinking process. You have to be willing, as he said, these subtle shifts, to not allow the inconsistencies to butt up against each other. No, keep them separate in the unconscious, put them behind.
Right. In a sense, we have been doing that. I think it's hard for conservatives and liberals to maybe see that because your brains are designed not to, right? They're designed not to see those inconsistencies. I'm right and those people are wrong. But I think if we go into our next episode really digging into logical inconsistencies on both the right and the left, I think we're going to point out how important it is to see this.
And if we do a deep dive as an example into cancel culture of the left, which would be our tribe, right? Because we both identify as liberals.
I identify as a centrist.
We're behaving like liberals in these conversations. We're acting in a liberal fashion by assuming that rationality is an important player and tool in lifting things up.
Even though liberals may have rationality more than conservatives, I'd like to not hand that power over to liberals as their identity.
Fair enough. You called me out. So let me say then, when I do my research on the history of cancel culture, I'm consciously going to be aware of the fact that I am digging for evidence against my tribe so that I can experience what that is, what kinds of inner pain are necessary in order to see your own hypocrisy and vet your own belief systems in order to come to a clearer understanding of what's going on and what's wrong. In other words, why I had such a powerful reaction to the Harvey Weinstein and the public shaming and the tearing down of his company before there was an actual trial. But then as it went on, I was happy to see women getting what their rights are, to speak out and be heard and be believed, and see all the bad guys falling, So what happened between my initial reaction, which was grounded in a cognizant belief that I could point to, the principle of everyone's innocent until proven guilty in this country, and why was I now willing to subscribe to the public shaming as a useful tool?
Were you swept up by the thought of your group?
By the power that my group suddenly had at its disposal, and that they were going to use it, by God. It's like, well, good for you. No more sitting silent in the corners and suffering. But let's explore that next time. That will be a useful endeavor.
Thank you, Rebecca. This has been awesome.
A pleasure.